Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly, and thanks for being here with us for the first artist talk of the Troc Talks Online Phase 2. We are here with us with Hannah Beilharz. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we have this meeting. Today, that sovereignty was never ceded and that dispossession and inequality continue within the colonial state. I want to welcome any First Nations people to this talk and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I will also want to acknowledge that this meeting may be watched from other lands, and I would encourage anyone in the chat room who is tuning in right now to write the name of the traditional owners and lands from which they are tuning in. I'm currently located on the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to provide a quick visual description of what I'm wearing and what I look like and for the background that I am in, the space I'm in. And I have black dark hair and I'm wearing purple flower shaped earrings, and I'm wearing a knitted gray and navish color knitted sweater, and I'm in my living room with a big TV in my background. And today we have Hannah Beilharz featured on our artist talk. And Hannah has been working and exhibiting in Narrm for the past 5 years. In 2017, she's completed a Bachelor of Fine Arts honors degree at RMIT, in which she majored in video, photography, printmaking, and installation. Her work explores how power structures and inequality impacts communities and individuals, both to encourage action within the present and imagine alternate futures. Beilharz's projects incorporate printmaking, video, and sculpture in site-responsive and immersive installations. Recent exhibitions Hannah had include Tandem Breaths, an online exhibition at Jacob Ari in 2020, and When Leaves Trace Skin at Red Gallery in 2019. Hannah also has an upcoming exhibition planned with Trocadero in 2021 in May, which is very exciting. Now I introduce it to Hannah.
Hello, thanks Kelly. Thanks for that beautiful acknowledgement of country. I just want to start with my background as well. I'm in a bedroom with pretty white walls. I'm wearing a white top, and I've got brown hair and a blonde brownish hair with a bun.
Awesome, thanks for that, Hannah. To begin our artist talk, can you briefly describe your practice or methodology or your art making process behind making this project?
Yeah, actually I wanted to start with acknowledging the footage that the works are made from. The original photos were shot on the traditional lands of the Bidawal, Gonakai and Nindi, Nujigam and Nigarugu Monaro people. So I wanted to acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded, and they are the traditional owners of that land. I also wanted to acknowledge the colonial impact of genocide and displacement, and also that I am a white settler and I still have a lot more to learn. And I'm hoping that my this recent project is going to contribute to that process of ongoing learning. Yeah, so I guess to describe my practice, so coming from a video and installation and also printmaking background, that was what my degree was in. And then since then, I guess I would describe my practice as being rooted in an embodied making process. So it's very much placed within how I feel in response to places and environments. And also a kind of methodology of making that is very layered, and there are multiple processes at work. So I like to start with one single image and work deeply into that through sort of many layers and many different ways of representing.
Yeah, that's great. Hannah, did you have works that you wanted to show now?
Yeah.
Isn't
Yeah, I
yeah?
guess to start off the works. So yeah, I thought it was good maybe to start with talking about, this is one of the original photographs, and then the making process sort of starting from this image. So in this image, just kind of covering over the landscape, I suppose, with pen. And the idea with this is actually it's a process for making lino cuts. So to transfer the image onto a printmaking surface, I'm colouring in every part that is actually white. So it's kind of like reversing the image around. And then I found that these images themselves were kind of interesting, even just as a process image. So yeah, I wanted to start with a few images of those.
Awesome. How did you come to explore the theme of this series of work?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, the traditional lands that I was on at the time where I took the pictures, I sort of was, it's also called the Cape Conran Coastal Park, the lands that I was on. And when I was there, I was sort of walking through the bushland, and I found this particular area that was completely burnt out and sort of really deeply burned and sort of destroyed from my limited understanding of fire practices. And I just found it to be a really stark sort of monochrome palette, and an interesting space to be in, because I suppose from like a settler perspective, I look at it and sort of think that it's this destroyed landscape. But also I know that there is other sort of knowledge around fire practices, and that this kind of space can also be generative in that it can sort of stimulate new life in the landscape. So yeah, I wanted to, I guess when I was taking the videos and footage at that site, I was sort of trying to really represent that feeling of surrealism and feeling kind of not at home in the landscape and confronted by it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Within what we've experienced and witnessed with the bushfires earlier this year, and then followed by the COVID-19 situation, has made us realize how much of a damage and destruction we've caused to our natural landscape, and how lack of knowledge we have, and how disregarded the indigenous knowledge behind the fire practices, and how to deal with like fire, or the relationship with fire has been in our general lives. Another following question I wanted to ask was, how does body materialize in the work?
Yeah, I think this is an important question, especially because my practice, like as I mentioned before, was sort of focused around embodied experience as well. And I guess that also comes from applying a feminist lens to my work and to the world. So with this work, I think having sort of like this stark landscape and having no visible bodies within it, no human sort of presence, was actually really important to talk about that idea of grief as well. And I suppose our own impact is kind of really obvious in that our own actions have caused this climate crisis and potentially caused really horrendous sort of bushfires that are really destructive. But also, as a lot of people in Australia living in urban cities, we're not exactly present in the landscapes ourselves, like we're not actually there as well. So I think that's an important part of the works, that there aren't any physical sort of representations of people.
Yeah, yeah. That's so true. Like our lives in the modern era, like being living in the urban cities, really does make us feel distant from the nature, and separate ourselves as outsiders from those natural landscapes, and then do not really associate ourselves as part of the landscape. And I think viewing your work makes us feel that, this is like what we should care, and it is part of our, like, the ecosystem we care, ecology and everything. But then it's so distant, and the absence of like any living creature in the photo or like physical shape, it highlights that absence as well, and makes us feel more kind of like distant. Um, how did you come to choose this specific mediums like photography and making coloring in with pen, such techniques to explore this theme?
Yeah, so I guess this is sort of one aspect of the project, like with the pen. But I think that photography is really, really central. Well, it's a really central part of my practice. I think just because it's a great way for me to kind of translate my experience of space, and particularly like my experience of specific environments. So that was really important to the work. And then I think the multiple processes of like making the works, I'm just going to move to some other images. So this is a lino cut made from that original image that I showed before. So kind of like moving into the detail of the works. So these mediums are sort of important for me because they allow me to sort of engage more deeply with the landscape. And sort of my feelings around desolation and grief of the landscape and disappearance as these things that we're sort of confronting as we go into a changed sort of climate world. And also so in the final iteration of this work, it'll be an installation, and so that's a really important medium sort of consideration too. So my hope for the work is that it won't just be these images, but also a sort of physically immersive experience for an audience, so that they can be within this surreal landscape and kind of experience that on a physical level as well.
Yeah. Have the works evolved over time, or if they have, how did they evolve over time, and what was your thought process behind those developments?
Yeah, so they've evolved a lot, I think, especially with COVID and things sort of changing in that way. The works have kind of, I think originally when I took the footage, I didn't really know how they would sort of become a work because they were just these very stark images. So I think it took a lot of time and actually really going into the detailed aspects of the work for me to understand how they could become a space or how they could communicate a feeling. And I think I'm just going to move to another image. Oh, this is one of the images where I've sort of changed to color. So this was more exploring. So that's kind of one of the shifts in the work, is from going from this really stark imagery, also kind of acknowledging this surrealist aspect of climate change, in that we are seeing some very strange images kind of on social media and within our world that sort of, I guess some people would call it apocalyptic, but often they're also quite beautiful images in some ways. So I guess these works are kind of moving into that element.
Yeah, I found the introduction of color in your work really interesting, and they represented something. Yeah.
So I experimented with a couple of different forms of introducing color. I think to just examine that surrealist space and what it could be like as the landscape changes from what we've known to something else.
Was there reason for you to choose the color red when you picked the color to introduce in your work, in your monochrome work?
Yeah, so when I did the original biro drawings and I was filling in the light, as I kind of explained with the process, I think that that sort of made me think about light in general, and also I guess with the images from the bushfires over the summer, how the light changed and even changed within the city. And so then I started to experiment with replacing the color white, or the appearance of white within the images, with a different color. And I sort of tried multiple ones. Like in this image, there's a pink light instead of the white, and sort of just filling in every little part of that. And then red, that was just to try and also get like a starker kind of image, to experiment with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in a way, I feel like the elimination of like white as a color from your work, and making it, instead of like red, instead of white, black and white, you're making it like black and red, and I feel like the color red represents not only the bushfire, but also like the damage and the consequence of the damage we have seen in the air turning into red during the bushfires. And it is some ways like surrealistic, but then also very like realistic depiction of what we have witnessed. And yeah, did you also want to show us some of your video works?
Yes.
Hannah, would you be able to explain a little bit about this work?
Yeah, so this is really moving on from introducing color and kind of really going a lot more deeply into that. And I suppose, especially working with video, there's sort of an element of abstraction that happens when introducing different layers of color. And I thought particularly bringing in this yellow sort of golden color was a way to symbolize this change. Like, I think also, like, it's not just about the destruction, but it also about how change is an opportunity for growth and for reimagining things in a different way. And I think especially with COVID and just having that opportunity to reflect more on things that have happened and on where we go from here. Yeah, I think one of the fundamental ways of like processing grief is understanding that like death is another beginning as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what this work was trying to go a little bit further into.
Yeah, that's great. We'll have a link to this video for those of you who couldn't view it properly on this screen. Were there any texts or readings or any sort of research materials that were critical to the process of your art making that you want to share with us?
Yeah, there were three really important kind of writers that have been really influential in developing the work.
Yep.
The first one was Glenn Albrecht, who is an Australian philosopher. He coined the term solastalgia, which is a sort of word to describe the feeling of, it's sort of like nostalgia, but when you're actually at home, and it's directly related to climate change and how our immediate environment is suddenly changing and becoming uninhabitable in some areas. And he's written a lot of stuff about the emotional aspects of climate change, and I think especially about the idea of grief and how we navigate that and how we use it as a generative tool for sort of moving forward. And then the other researcher was American Stephen Pine. His work is really great. He's written a lot of stuff about the pyrocene. So he believes that we're living through a pyrocene. We're living through a time when fire is actually becoming very prevalent due to really bad sort of fire practices, and that there's a really large scale sort of emergence of wildfires. So his work has been really influential for that reason. And also Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu was a really, really important influence for the work too, just in his discussion of fire and kind of like bringing more understanding to the concept that fire is not just something to reduce hazard or to cause destruction. It's also a farming tool. It's something that can bring growth and new life, especially within the Australian landscape where it's been tended to with fire for really a long time. So yeah.
Awesome. I think they provide various like different ways of viewing fire and rethinking our relationship with fire and how we can really rethink about fire as a part of the life cycle instead of something that is only destructive. Yeah, I think that was great. Another question I wanted to ask was that how has your art practice or this project changed during the COVID lockdown? Especially not being able to access your studio space, having to work with what you have at your home. How did you cope with those processes?
Yeah, I actually found well at first it was a really, really hard time. I think probably everybody who's in the arts went through that stage in March or April where our entire years got cancelled in terms of shows and things that we were planning to do. So it was really hard to actually maintain motivation at that particular moment, just with the uncertainty and sort of even questioning, what's the relevance of actually making work right now. And so there was sort of that aspect, but I think actually looking back now, it's been really, really important for this particular project. Like it's been really good for it in that without access to a studio and a larger scale sort of space as I normally work with, I had to kind of move things into a smaller scale and it was a lot more intimate. And so that meant that I was sort of making the works in this way where I was sort of really deeply engaging with the landscape on this small scale. And I think that was good just as a sort of therapeutic practice as well, having these sort of early mornings of drawing and going into the works. And yeah, I think that sort of like reflecting on that then brought this sort of processing of grief and things like that more into the foreground of the work. And yeah, it was a good thing in the end, although it wasn't like a very easy time.
Yeah, sometimes like these new restrictions become a way of like become tools in your practice and then suggest new ways of playing and experimenting with your work. Hannah, could you explain to us how is the project culturally or historically or socially integrated?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of related to the researchers that I mentioned before, but I think definitely the works are very specific to the context of Australia and to our specific kind of disconnect and lack of familiarity with the landscape and with the landscape as a fire sort of environment too. Yeah, and I think the work kind of sits within that history of colonization and kind of that loss as well, loss of knowledge and of practices that kind of sustain the landscape over a very long period. And yeah, so that's kind of where the works are sitting within this contemporary moment of climate change as well. And sort of on the edge of imagining where we go from here as well, and how do we exist within this new environment or new environments that are sort of becoming present.
Yeah, and I think your work also makes a very valid and relevant point in relation to how disconnected our communities are in terms of between the culture groups or those like heritage groups or communities, in terms of sharing their knowledge with each other or acknowledging the significance of the other communities' knowledge and experience and history behind certain fire practices. And I think throughout what we've witnessed, especially early this year, we've witnessed Australia's Australia's poor management, particularly in the case of bushfires. And I think your work makes a strong point about those political backgrounds of Australia at the moment. How has showing your work in digital space and thinking of or developing this project that is to be shown on online, has that much different from what you would usually do for physical exhibitions in gallery space?
Yeah, so yeah, that would be, it's very, very different for me. I did do a sort of semi-online exhibition earlier this year,
Mm-hmm.
But I found it's really not a sort of space that suits my practice. I feel like that a really important part of my work is sort of the sort of physical experience in space. So it's an interesting sort of place to make work online. I sort of feel like sometimes there's a wider reach in that you can sort of reach audiences across the world that you wouldn't normally, and that's a good kind of aspect of it. But it is a very tricky thing. I've noticed, like, I mean, I know that we've kind of had to adapt to this time, but I do feel like there's some things that you just can't communicate through a screen.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to moving back into working in gallery spaces.
Yeah, that's true. Even like as a viewer, I think the viewing experience of your work would very much be different from looking at it on screen or having it in front of me in the physical space, because I feel like I would spend a lot of time like staring at your work in a bench or from distance or like up close. You know, that control of like control of the distance between the work and me, the surface and me. And I think that will very much change the viewing experience and how the viewers interpret your work as well. Yeah, but I think also being online has that great advantage of reaching more global audience and possibly yeah, easier to transfer to different platforms, I guess. Yeah. Another question I wanted to ask was I come from South Korea, and being a new Australian, I feel like my knowledge and understanding of fire in terms of related to our landscape or related to like my existence in the natural landscape is really lacking. And I am starting to notice that a lot more as I come to the news of bushfires and its and the climate crisis. What do you suggest for people who are not so familiar with the knowledge or too familiar with this part of this field of research to do or to embed in their daily lives to feel more familiar or to educate themselves or to widen their perspective? What do you suggest us to do?
Well, I feel a little bit like I'm not really an expert either. Like, this is, I mean, part of my practice, like this particular project is important to me because it means that I can learn more about this topic and that I'm really interested in it.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people who are, you know, far more expert than I am. And I'm sort of really using it in a sort of, I'm using that knowledge in a cultural way rather than a knowledge production way. So in that I'm making images and experiences out of it. But I think actually Fire Country is a really beautiful book written by a First Nations person about their sort of learning about fire and learning about fire practices. And I think this is a really great This is a really great book to start with. Also, the researchers I mentioned, a lot of them have free YouTube lectures. So if you wanted to go more into the technical understandings of fire practice, then that's also possible through just looking online. And I think probably more important than those things is to kind of engage with First Nations peoples and their online platforms at the moment in how they are talking about country and the things that are happening and what needs to happen. And I guess like a really important aspect of that is also donating to organisations that are working on this kind of stuff and regenerating and gathering this knowledge. There's a Fire Sticks organisation. They do some really good work. I think they got more attention sort of after the bushfires. So they're a good organisation to look into as well.
Yeah. I think it's great that you took this journey and then explored this new series of works. Awesome. Thanks for such a detailed and descriptive explanation of your practice and project, Hannah. Just for your reference, Hannah has been sharing the links to the organizations or the research she's mentioned before in the chat room. So make sure you click and check them out as well. Thanks to everyone again for being here with us. And thanks, Hannah, for delivering such a lovely artist talk.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for being a great moderator.